Open the Timaeus to passage 20d. You will not find a fairy tale. You will find a chain of attribution as careful as anything in Thucydides. Plato names the messenger, the lawgiver Solon. He names the source, the priests of the temple of Neith at Sais. He names the dating method, temple records kept on stone columns. He gives a specific location, beyond what the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules. He gives a specific date, 9,000 years before Solon. He even gives the name of the relative who passed the manuscript down through his family. The question is not whether Atlantis existed. The question is why we decided Plato was lying. To understand what Plato actually terms, you have to read the text on a 60 BCE. The Timaeus was written around 360s, but a peculiar one. Most of Plato's dialogues build their cases through argument. The Timaeus opens with something different. It opens with a story Critias says he heard from his grandfather, who heard it from his own father, who heard it from Solon himself, and Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver who lived around 590 BCE, claimed he heard it from Egyptian priests in the Nile Delta city of Sais. The chain matters. In Greek historical writing of the period, this kind of layered attribution was not decoration. It was the closest thing the ancient world had to a citation. Herodotus does the same thing constantly. So does Thucydides. When a Greek author wanted to mark a claim as serious testimony rather than poetic invention, he named his source. Plato names 4 generations of sources for Atlantis. He does not do this for the Republic. He does not do this for the Symposium. He does it once, in the Timaeus and its companion dialogue the Critias, and the thing he attributes is the existence of a sunken continent. The setting is also specific. Solon, according to the dialogue, traveled to Egypt as part of his program of legal and political study. He visited the temple of the goddess Neith at Sais. The priests there, one of whom is identified in some later tradition as Sais, told him that the Greeks were children when it came to history. The priest is direct about this. He tells Solon that the Greeks have only one set of memories because every few centuries some catastrophe wipes the human record clean and forces civilization to start over. Egypt, the priest says, has been spared from the worst of these resets because the Nile floods predictably and the climate is stable. So the Egyptian temples have records the Greeks have lost. And among those records, written on stone columns inside the sanctuary, is the account of a war between ancient Athens and a sea power called Atlantis. Now consider the details Plato then provides. He gives a date 9,000 years before Solon's visit, which puts the events of the Atlantis story somewhere around 9,600 BCE. He gives a location. Atlantis was a large island situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the strait the Greeks knew as the boundary between the Mediterranean and the great outer ocean. Today we call it the Strait of Gibraltar. He gives a political structure. Atlantis was governed by 10 kings, descended from the god Poseidon, with the eldest line ruling from a central capital. He gives architecture. Concentric rings of land and water, a central citadel, a great canal connecting the harbor to the sea. He gives metallurgy. A metal called orichalcum, said to be second in value only to gold. He gives military scale, armies large enough to threaten the entire Mediterranean. And then crucially, he gives a Greek word for what kind of account this is. In Timaeus passage 26e, the speaker calls the story a logos alethinos, a true account. Not a mythos, not a poetic invention. A logos alethinos. The distinction in classical Greek between logos and mythos was not absolute, but it was meaningful. A logos was a reasoned discourse, an account grounded in testimony or argument. A mythos was a traditional tale, often with divine elements, valued for its meaning rather than its factual reliability. When Plato has his speaker mark the Atlantis story as a logos alethinos, he is doing something deliberate. So why has the dominant reading for more than 2,000 years been that Plato simply made it up? The honest answer is that the dismissal happened in several waves, and each wave had its own reasons. The first came from within Plato's own school. Aristotle, his most famous student, reportedly remarked that the man who invented Atlantis also sunk it, suggesting Plato had fabricated the story as a literary device. Whether Aristotle actually said this is debated, but the line stuck. From the Hellenistic, Greek, and Roman commentators treated Atlantis as Plato's invention, a philosophical fable about hubris and divine justice. The second wave came during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, when European scholars began to look for Atlantis as a real place and consistently failed to find it. The search turned the question political. Some used Atlantis to argue for the antiquity of European civilization. Others used it to argue for the priority of the Americas, recently encountered by European explorers. By the 18th century, serious classists had grown tired of the whole enterprise and pushed back hard in the other direction. Atlantis became a literary symbol, An allegory of Athenian ambition, a warning about empire. It became, in academic prose, anything but a record of an actual place. The third wave came in the 19th and 20th centuries with the rise of professional archaeology. Archaeologists could excavate, they could date material remains, and they could not find a sunken continent beyond Gibraltar, because at the dates Plato gives, no such continent could have been built. The human technical capacities Plato describes for Atlantis, organized states, large-scale architecture, large fleets, complex metallurgy, simply did not exist in 9600 BCE according to the archaeological record. The Holocene was barely beginning, agriculture was still spreading. The earliest known cities are thousands of years younger than Plato's date. So the trained archaeologist concludes reasonably enough that the story cannot be literally true in the details Plato gives. If you found this exploration valuable, more deep dives into ancient texts and lost traditions are available on the channel. The archaeological argument is strong, but it is also narrow. It rules out the literal Atlantis of Plato's text, the sunken continent beyond Gibraltar, at the precise date he names. What it does not rule out is the possibility that something real lies underneath the literary surface. Plato did not invent his historical methods from nothing. The chain of attribution, the Egyptian temple records, the specific dating method, these elements all reflect how serious historical claims actually worked in his world. If he wanted to fabricate a pure allegory, he had simpler tools available. The Republic uses none of this machinery. The Phaedo uses none of this machinery. The Timaeus uses all of it. One possibility, raised by a long line of scholars who refuse to accept either the literalist or the dismissive position, is that Plato preserved a distorted memory of a real catastrophe. The Eastern Mediterranean has experienced several civilization-ending events that left lasting cultural memory. The Minoan civilization on Crete collapsed in part due to the Thera eruption around 1600 BCE. That event sent tsunamis across the Aegean and devastated coastal settlements. The Minoans had concentric harbor architecture. They were a sea power. They suffered a catastrophic submergence of some of their territory. The date is wrong by about 7,000 years. The location is wrong. But the structural similarities are striking enough that several 20th century scholars proposed Thera and Crete as the historical kernel of Plato's account. Another possibility involves the older question of Egyptian record-keeping. Sais was a real place. The Temple of Neith was real. Egyptian priests did claim access to dynastic records stretching back tens of thousands of years, claims that classical Greek visitors took seriously enough to record. Whether those records existed in the form Plato describes, stone columns inscribed with continuous chronology, is impossible to verify now because the temple complex at Sais was systematically destroyed over the centuries that followed. What survives is the report of what Greek visitors said the priest said. That is, technically, the same evidentiary basis as any other testimony in ancient historiography. Then there is the Critias. The companion dialogue to the Timaeus picks up the Atlantis story where the Timaeus left it and promises to deliver the full account. The Critias begins with a detailed description of ancient Athens before the supposed war. It moves to a detailed description of Atlantis itself, its geography, its population, its political institutions. And then, partway through the description of the Atlantean assembly, the text simply stops, mid-sentence. The dialogue we possess ends with the words of Zeus, beginning to address the gathered gods about the punishment. Atlantis must suffer for its corruption, and then nothing. The Critias is the only major Platonic dialogue that ends abruptly in the middle of its argument. Scholars have argued about this for centuries. Some say Plato simply lost interest. Others say he died before completing it. Others suggest he abandoned the project because the story had outgrown its philosophical usefulness. There is no consensus. Whatever his reasons, the silence at the end of the Critias is part of the record. None of this proves Atlantis existed in the form Plato described. The geography does not work. The dates do not work with the archaeological record. The political and military details look like 4th century Athenian projections of an ideal opponent for an idealized ancient Athens. A careful reader will note all of this. A careful reader will also note that none of it answers the simpler question of why Plato put the story together in this particular way, with this particular machinery of attribution, in this particular pair of dialogues, and then left the second one unfinished. The standard answer is that he was writing philosophy in the form of fiction. That answer is defensible. It is also, on the textual evidence, harder to maintain than its proponents usually admit. Plato gave his readers a chain of named sources, a documented dating method, a specific geographic anchor, a logos alethinos. He gave them all the markers of serious historical testimony. He may have been writing fiction. He may have been preserving distorted memory. He may have been doing something else entirely. The text itself does not settle the question. What the text does settle is that the modern conversation about Atlantis, the one that asks whether Plato was telling the truth, has the framing slightly wrong. Plato told us where he got the story. He told us who passed it down and when. He told us what kind of account he believed he was relating. The interesting question is not whether he made it up. The interesting question is what he thought he was doing when he wrote those passages, and why 2,500 years later we still cannot agree on the answer.